And now for our message today. This is going to be actually part two of a two-part message that I gave part one to a little while back. So at any rate, this part two will be ranging from the Civil War through the Eisenhower administration. We will begin during the Civil War, where Lincoln reluctantly signed a bill called the Confiscation Act, which said in effect that slaveholders forfeited their ownership of any property, including enslaved Africans, used by the Confederate military. The Union could confiscate such people as contraband. Legally, they were no longer enslaved, nor were they freed. They could, however, work for the Union Army for wages and live in the abysmal conditions of the contraband camps. Yeah, give me just a minute here. Has anyone here heard about the contraband camps in school? Good, I knew Al would. So at any rate, the conditions there were so poor in these camps that 1 out of every 4 of the 1.1 million men, women, and children in the contraband camps died in one of the worst public health disasters in U.S. history. There was only one doctor for every 8,000 people in the camps, and almost 300,000 Black people died during that time. On Maryland's Emancipation Day, the newly freed people paraded to the president's house. Lincoln urged them to improve yourself both morally and intellectually, while he also supported Maryland's new constitution, which barred Blacks from voting and from attending public schools. The Constitution also sent thousands of Black children into long-term indentures back to their former slave masters against their parents' objections. But they were free thanks to the states' rights agreements. Much of the Reconstruction effort in the South worked that way. It seemed that just when the turn of the century came and Blacks were about to see the promise of equality and freedom, someone or something always came along and destroyed it. In an explosive wartime book published in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race, New York lawyer Madison Grant constructed a racial ethnic hierarchy of Nordics, the new term for Anglo-Saxons, at the top, and Jews, Italians, the Irish, Russians, and all non-whites on lower rungs of this new social construct. Grant suggested the races rarely vary intellectually and morally, just they do physically. It has taken 50 years to learn that speaking English, wearing good clothes, and going to school and church does not transform a Negro into a white man. Many of Grant's disgusting ideas sound a lot like a former president we all know today who's made similar critical remarks about non-white Hispanic and African people, saying that they are poisoning America's blood with their immigration to America. Yes, our racism today is no mystery as to its origins and its current American enablers. While Germany surrendered in World War I, an embittered Austrian soldier sprinted into German politics, where he gained some cheers for his nasty speeches against Marxists and Jews. In 1924, Adolf Hitler was jailed for attempting revolution. Sound familiar? Hitler also used this time in prison and Madison Grant's racist book to write his magnum opus, Mein Kampf. The Nazi leader later explained and thanked Grant for writing The Passing of the Great Race, which Hitler called my Bible. After World War I had cut off immigration from Europe, labor recruiters from northern industries headed into southern towns looking for a new labor supply. Southern Blacks did not need these recruiters to entice them to escape a place that in some ways was worse than hell. When migrants reached northern cities, black and white natives called these migrants who had moved 600 miles seeking work and a better life lazy. But over the course of 6 decades, some 6 million Black Southerners left their homes, transforming Black America into a primarily Southern population with a national and urban one. And so at that time, segregationist ideas became further nationalized and urbanized in the process. Does anyone here know the origin of the racial term mulatto? People believed African natives belonged to a different species than whites. They further proselytized that if the two races mated, the offspring would become sterile, like that of when a donkey mates a horse. The result is a mule that cannot bear offspring. The term mule was then bastardized to become mulatto. In 1918, sociologist and eugenicist Edward Byron Reuter finished writing The Mulatto in the United States from his base at the University of Iowa. Reuter made a name for himself, arguing that anything Black people had achieved was, in fact, the achievement of biracial people. By doing so, he inferred that if mixed race people were successful, it was that the white blood in them is what was the reason for their success. He situated biracial people as a sort of racial middle class, below superior whites, but above inferior full Blacks, as they were called then. Yes, he done us Iowans proud. President Calvin Coolidge, who replaced Harding after his sudden death in 1923, happily signed the Immigration Act of 1924 before his reelection, allowing immigration from only Nordic countries. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend, Coolidge wrote as vice president-elect in 1921. The Nordics propagate themselves successfully, while with other races, the outcome shows deterioration on both sides. The Great Depression signaled the end of the party of Lincoln's hold on government and the beginning of this Democratic Party's return to power. Granted, with Roosevelt, it was a different party, but still had many racists in its makeup. To secure the congressional votes of Southern Democrats, Roosevelt and Northern Democrats crafted the new bills such that to Southern Blacks, it seemed more like the old deal. Just like in the old days before Roosevelt, segregationists were given the power to locally administer and racially discriminate the relief coming from these federal programs. And segregationists made sure that farmers and domestics, Blacks' primary vocations, were excluded from the law's new job benefits like minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, and unionizing rights. Black neighborhoods were also redlined and prohibitive from getting mortgages. This might be a good time to bring up the ideas of Black separatism and assimilationists, championed by Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. Marcus Garvey may have initiated America's first Black separatist movement, the United Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA. Here's a quote from him on the topic of separatism. For God's sake, you men and women who have been keeping yourselves away from the people of your own African race, cease the ignorance, unite your hands and hearts with the people of Africa. Sons and daughters of Africa, I say to you, arise. Take on the toga of racial pride and throw off the brand of ignominy which has kept you back for so many centuries. Dash asunder the petty prejudices within your own fold. Du Bois was, however, initially an assimilationist, which put him at odds with separatist Marcus Garvey on how to achieve racial equality for African Americans. Du Bois, like many others, eventually became an anti-racist. I mention this bit of history because other brilliant intellectuals and men of courage, like Dr. King and Malcolm X, often opposed each other, but always did so with the welfare of the people at heart. They bravely spoke out about racism in ways that provoked our nation at a highly dangerous time when powerful, violent racist groups were prominent throughout America. When it came to denouncing racism, scholars first had to define it. But in fairness, the Oxford Dictionary's first recorded utterance of the word racism was coined by General Richard Henry Pratt in 1902 while railing against the evils of segregation. Unfortunately, he also gets credit for two other famous coinages: kill the Indian, save the white man, and the only good Indian is a dead Indian. Throughout this entire period, up to and beyond World War II, there was an intelligentsia comprised of both black and white assimilationists, separatists, and anti-racist writers, sociologists, etc., who fought the good fight against racism through books and essays we rarely hear about in our high school history books. Here's just a few of the people from that group: Robert Park, Richard Wright, E. Franklin Fraser, Melville Herkowitz, Zora Neale Hurston, and Carter G. Woodson. During this period, racism took another turn as white assimilationists and philanthropists were taking over the racial discourse in the academy. They were customarily shutting out black scholars as being too subjective and biased to study black people. Really? Swedish Nobel laureate, economist Gunnar Myrdal, produced a nearly 1,500-page study published in 1944 on racial problems. Myrdal shined an optimistic light on what he termed in his title as an American dilemma. He identified racial problem as the moral problem. He went on to say, white Americans display an astonishing ignorance about the Negro. Whites ignorantly viewed Negroes as criminal, as having loose sexual morals, as being religious, as having a gift for dancing and singing, and as happy-go-lucky children of nature. Myrdal convinced himself and many of his readers that ignorance had produced racist ideas and that racist ideas had produced racist policies, and therefore that the great majority of white people in America would be prepared to give the Negro a substantially better deal if they only knew the facts. Excuse me, my allergies are kicking up. However, before Truman left office, his Justice Department had submitted a brief for yet another desegregation case before the U.S. Supreme Court heard oral arguments of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka for a second time in 1953. At a White House dinner, Eisenhower invited his newly appointed Chief Justice, Earl Warren, and grabbed a seat next to the eminent lawyer defending segregationist John Davis, someone President repeatedly praised as a great man. On a stroll to the coffee table, Eisenhower told Warren he could understand why Southerners wanted to make sure their sweet little girls were not required to sit in school alongside some big black buck. On May 21st, 1854, the RNC had to state the Brown decision falls appropriately within the Eisenhower administration's many-frontal attack on global communism, since Eisenhower refused to personally endorse the Brown decision. In 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Forbes deployed the National Guard to block the Little Rock Nine from desegregating Central High School, defying the court order with the globally circulating sights and sounds of government troops defending howling segregationist mobs. Little Rock harmed America's freedom brand. Our enemies are gloating over this decision, Eisenhower wailed at the nationally televised speech, and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation. Eisenhower and his aides agonized for 2 weeks, seeking solutions that could keep both his political image in the South and his American image of freedom fighter abroad intact, all to no avail. On September 24th, in a decision he later regarded as the most repugnant act in all of his 8 years in the White House, Eisenhower sent in federal troops to protect the Little Rock students as they entered the school. Yes, the civil rights movement was coming. Du Bois was stunned watching the unfolding Montgomery bus boycott during the 1956 election year. It was not the boycott's initial mobilizer, Alabama State College professor Joanne Robinson, nor the boycott's drivers. It was those walking Black female domestics who surprised him. Du Bois sent a message of encouragement, and King sent a grateful reply. King had read Du Bois' books, and he later characterized him as an intellectual giant who saw through the poisonous fog of lies and depicted Black people as inferior. Du Bois also sent a proclamation to the Indian journal Gandhi Mag, saying King, in his strident commitment to nonviolent civil disobedience, could be the American Gandhi. Juxtaposed to the assimilationists was Elijah Muhammad's growing Chicago-based Nation of Islam, the NOI, in the late 50s. They won't let you be white, and you won't be Black, former convict and NOI's new Harlem minister, Malcolm X, liked to say. You don't want to be African, and you can't be American. You in bad shape. CBS's Mike Wallace brought Malcolm X and the NOI to the attention of millions in the 1959 sensational 5-part television series entitled The Hate That Hate Produced, a study in the rise of Black racism and Black supremacy. In 1964, Malcolm, who was Muslim, boarded a plane and embarked on the obligatory Hajj to Mecca. After a lifetime of the theater of American racism that began with the lynching of his father, Malcolm X during his trip, saw for the first time all colors from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans interacting as equals. The experience changed him. Damn. Saying, the true Islam has shown me that a blanket indictment of white people is as wrong as when Blacks make blanket indictments against when whites make blanket indictments against Blacks. He said from then on, he took on the racists no matter their skin color. Although American media outlets reported the change, the narrative of Malcolm X as hating white people endured until his untimely assassination in February 21st, 1965. This, unfortunately, is about all we have time for today. I hope the seats didn't get too hard and that you found this message informative. We will finish the story up to current times in another Sunday. And again, thank you much for listening.